So when I talked to Sue this morning about what today's video should be about, she wanted to talk about her plants. And I said, Sue, folks in the RV community don't want to talk about plants. They want to talk about smashing into stuff with your RV, fires, accidents, and oh yeah, let's not forget leaks and floods. Now, if you've watched the channel for any amount of time, I'm not going to go into the agony that we had when our gray tank was leaking. I'll link the video up so you can find it if that's a possibility that you've got going on. But what I want to talk about today actually is floods. I want to talk about our first major leak that we ever had. I want to talk about our first flood that we had. And I also want to talk about the flood that's very common that I'm trying to avoid us having. I promise you're going to learn something by the time you end up watching this video. So come on, let's get going. Okay, on many of the episodes, we always talk about turning your water off here on the main spigot before you leave when you go to Walmart or when you go whatever. I'm apologizing about the traffic in the background. We're just a tad close to 76th Street, but you get the point. So wherever you're going, we always turn the water off. Unfortunately, you can't always count on this being the good technique, because you've always got neighbors that are connecting and disconnecting. You got kids, you got people helping, moving hoses around. So that could end up being a problem, not intentional, but you could get a mix-up with just turning it off there. So what we do is when we leave, our water from that spigot back there is eventually coming into our pressure gauge, and we turn our water off right here as well when we leave for the day. That way the water can't come from the supply, but if that gets fooled around with kids or mistakenly moved around by the park officials or your brand new neighbor, this will prevent the problem. So that's where we turn our water off. Now you'll notice this fancy setup here. This is our Go Blue Tech Technologies water filtration and water softener setup with these awesome quick disconnects and the braided hoses. I'll link up in the corner the video that we did on that. Pretty good information in there. You might want to check that out. Let's look inside the wet bay and see what other tricks we use to not have a flood. So I talked about in the past, one of the mistakes that you can make and have a flood is if you leave your flush hose hooked up. Now, we very easily could hook this and put this in there and shut the door and be an awesome looking setup and just operate our flush valve when we need to flush. And, you know, we would be pretty macho. But I'm here to tell you that if you don't have kind of a trick that when you hook this up and it goes across this door and you forget to unhook it, and worse yet, you forget to turn off the flushing valve that's sending water to that. If you hook it up like this, when you shut the door, you have one more chance to remember, especially when the hose is full of water and it's delivering water longer than you wanted it to. This hose is going to be hard and you're not going to be able to shut the door on it unless you slam the heck out of it, and in that case I guess you deserve to have a flood. Another thing you'll notice is that the city water and tank fill connection max 60 psi. I'm here to tell you that they're not kidding. The few times that I didn't have a pressure gauge that was protecting me before the water was delivered to our rig, I ended up having leaks almost instantly because I was slightly over or I was bumping up against that 60 psi. And I would typically have it on connections that had these twist worm drive radiator type clamp things, which technically speaking, I shouldn't be using. You'll notice that the typical connection in your rig is this PEX type connector, and it's a spring type connector that it's always getting tighter, even if the hose kind of wants to get looser. I know that doesn't quite make sense, but that's what happens on a spring type connector. A worm drive connector like this, when you tighten it and it's nice and tight, it is dimensionally at that diameter. And as the hose degrades and softens and loosens, the clamp can't do anything because it doesn't have springiness in it. It is dimensionally to a dimension. Don't use these in connections. Obviously, I'm not following my own advice. That's because I did not have a PEX tubing connector gadget to do that. I do have it now. Once that gives me a problem, or if it starts leaking, I will replace it, or on a day when I got nothing to do, I'll do that. One other tip I might point out when I'm here is I do have this save-a-drop meter that allows me to know how many gallons I'm putting in my tank when I'm filling it to rinse it. Obviously, that's not necessarily a flooding type issue, but you know, it is pretty handy to know how much you've put in there when you think, oh, I only put 5 or 6 gallons in, and all of a sudden you're at 21 gallons. You know, if your tank's 25 gallons, you might want to know that. So I would suggest having one of these as well. Now, we're going to go inside, and I'm going to show you the first leak that I had, because remember, I promised I'm going to talk about 3 of them. I'm going to show you the first leak we had, and it was under our half bathroom sink, and it was related to my flushing, where I was flushing my black tank, and I'm sending water to sewage rinse. I'm sending it into my black tank. And you want to know where it goes first before it goes in the black tank? It goes into the half bath up to the almost the sink area where you're washing your hands. What? Let's go take a look. Once again, I'd like to show you the utility of learning to search on the IRV2 website. You can see that I typed in black tank flush diagram, and usually I put the word IRV2 also in the search. I don't put the .com, and you can see that I came up with some results here. It turns out that I use the site enough that I know that Gary Jones is a very prolific poster. You can see that he had 11,500 posts, and I trust what he does, as well as this guy, Old Biscuit, that's got 28,000 posts. And lo and behold, you see that my issue is this check valve number 3 on this diagram. Remember, everything that ever went wrong with your RV has been researched and talked about on this website, and it's in your best interest to learn how to use it so that you can diagnose things and start heading in the right direction during almost any repair you need to do. Now, I know it's a little embarrassing coming into somebody's bathroom, but you better get used to it, because this is where our first leak was, but it's also where our first flood was. So let's get a little comfortable here with what we're looking at, and then we'll progress onto that one. Oh boy. So I had showed you the hose that I hook up to put rinse water into my black tank to rinse the black tank out after it's been used a number of cycles. And Sue took some B-roll already, but at the top of this set of plastic hoses, right on the top, directly underneath this counter in the corner here, is actually it's called an air admittance valve. And I'll try to put a PDF document or a picture of what that looks like. And what started to happen, and we didn't know that the water was coming from here, but what started to happen is we had a leak outside. And we never ever thought to look in here. So for a very long time, that leak was happening up here underneath the counter where my light is, and it was traveling down these pipes, and it was going through the floor, and it was at that point, once it was through the floor, that I was attributing my leak to a lot of other different things. Let's go out and discuss what I worked on and fixed before I found a leak, and then how I fixed the leak. So at this very RV park, I think, one day I opened this bay, and this is all wet in here. And I don't know why it was, but if you know anything about how RVs are built, a lot of times the ceiling of a compartment like this has this cheap plastic that's like stapled up into the top. And what happened is the half bath water that was leaking here actually at first traveled over into this bay. And it was one day when I opened this bay up that I had water on top of this plastic bin here. And water comes from a lot of areas on your RV, and on the roof here, when my air conditioners run, because my gutter system is kind of primitive on this system, it comes off the roof and the water goes wherever the heck it wants to go. So I thought, is that air conditioning water? Or if it's raining, is it water that somehow came down here and it jumped around here? Was it this seal here? Where I attributed it to is this awning above the slide topper. When I went up and looked to see if my leak was from up there, the awning almost looked like all of the bolts that holds the far side of the awning. You know, the awning comes out, well, something has to hold it to the RV on the other end. I thought that was the leak, so I was caulking the heck out of that. So weeks were going by and months were going by. And unbeknownst to me, the leak was actually coming from that air admittance valve that I talked about, and it was dripping here into the underside of this, and the water was traveling in different areas. I also had water that was discoloring the corners of this bay and the floor in it, and I thought, well, maybe some of that water is coming from back here and radially is hitting the floor and coming up and getting on the tanks and going through pipes. God only knows. But finally I found where the water was coming from. By the way, I do have a video on sealing the wheel wells of the RV a little bit better so it doesn't throw water into this bay. Different subject, don't want to pollute that. Now, if you don't think we had problems with floods, I want to show you how many people carry a shop vac, a wet shop vac, to pick and clean up water. I never recovered this with the plastic that I was talking about because, quite honestly, I want to know when it's leaking. And these pipes that are right here are the ones that I was showing with the flashlight when I was in the rig. And the water was coming pouring down. Remember, this was plastic here. The plastic would deliver it to the next bay over, and it was just throwing us off. Now you can see the Chan Man here. Since he's Mr. Paranoid, I put these in here now further so that if I ever develop any leaks in that water piping that goes to that vanity, and in fact also that flush area, that I can just shut everything down and be done with it. I don't think I mentioned when I was over in the wet bay that not only do we turn off our water, the domestic supply that we get from the campground, in the two spots that I showed you, but we always make sure that our pump is off as well. Let's go inside and I'll show you why that's important. So one day, we're out here with people that were visiting us, and we're all piling in the car, and we're just about ready to leave, and all of a sudden, oh, I forgot something. And I gotta go inside to go get whatever I forgot. Let me show you what I found. So depending upon how good the microphone is, you might actually hear the water pump every once in a while going on. But when we were getting ready to leave and we were in the car and everybody was all excited, let's go for pizza or wherever the heck we were going, and I had forgotten something, I came back in here and it was either in this bathroom or the middle bathroom. I actually think it was the middle bathroom. The water had been left ajar. And, you know, it doesn't look like a lot, but when your water is running like this, or however ajar it was, and you're gone for 6 or 8 hours, if you only had, you know, 15, 20 gallons of capacity left to put that water somewhere, you could have a problem. Or if you were in a situation where you weren't hooked up to water and the only water you had was the water in your tank and you're wasting it, then once again, that's a problem. And remember, when your gray tank starts to overflow, what happens is it starts to pressurize the tank, and the lowest level that is an outlet for water that's from your gray tank will start overflowing. And guess what? In our rig, it's right here. It's the shower will start to fill up with water when you're over pressurizing it. Now, one of the key things that might have triggered me, this happened so long ago I don't remember, I might not even have seen this. I might have been fiddling around doing something else. But if we listen long enough here, our pump is down here. And when you just have a little leak, the pump goes, and it's going on and off. And that's a key that you either have a leak or you have a faucet open. If you're laying in bed at night and you're on your pump, and every once in a while you hear your pump ever so small, just kind of repressurize itself, means you have a leak somewhere. And you should be working on finding that, because eventually the way you're going to find it is when your floorboards rot through and something on your rig falls out on the highway when you're driving around. So how do you prevent that? Come on in. So what we do is, when we leave the rig, we always play a little game with me and Sue. You know, I'll go, well, I ceremoniously announce, well, I'm going to turn the water off, hon. And she says, okay. And I said, okay, you're in charge of turning the pump off. So over here, we have a button that I can press. That's a water pump button. And I will press it. My water pump is on there. And when it's off, it's there. So we can glance from a distance to make sure that that pump is off. And so when I'm walking out of the rig, I'll say to Sue, Sue, is the pump off? And sometimes she might have to walk 5 or 6 feet back in the rig and look at one of the 3 or 4 nameplates that we have to make sure it's off. So that's a tip. Make sure not only you turn your water off at the spigot, but that your water pump is off when you're leaving. And remember, that issue we had was because the handle was left ajar. And if you're in the habit of slamming that valve and just not paying much attention to how you're turning it off, you absolutely are going to have that problem. Try to change your ways very definitively on and flip it off. So the other thing is you want to make sure you leave the pump switch off when you're traveling, because what can happen with all of the racket that you have while you're going down the road, you will not hear that your pump is going on and off. It could be on full blast and you wouldn't know the difference. And if something tips in your rig or falls against a valve and turns the water on, or you inadvertently left it on because you were filling a jug or a pot or something, and then you jump in a car and you're going down the road, what will happen is a couple things. A, you will empty your water tank, so wherever you get, you will have no water. And if you were going to a place that didn't have the ability to fill, that's bad. The other thing is you could overflow your gray tank, and we talked about that you'll fill up your shower here and eventually it'll go off over the floor. And then the third fun thing that you'll have is you might burn your pump out if it's always on and it's struggling to pump that last 10 gallons that's in your the bottom of your tank, and 5 hours later when you're traveling, your pump will be burned out. So a lot of reasons to make sure that that switches off. Let's talk about our most recent flood. The fun continues.
Oh, man.
Remember, I promised you this will be our favorite room today. let's go back and talk about our second real flood that we had. One time we went to visit our buddy Mel in northern Florida. And when we got there, we were real excited to get together because we were looking forward to it for probably about 4 hours of travel. And Sue made the proverbial Costco stuffed peppers that we were going to have there. And so we made them in the convection oven or whichever, our toaster oven, whatever. And we were all set, ready to go. And someone, we don't know who, I'm almost going to think maybe it was me, before I left, had to go to the restroom. Now, we always shut the toilet so that if anything would ever fall into the toilet, it doesn't run through our macerator. When you do that, it makes what's happening in the toilet quieter. So like when you're flushing or when it's done flushing and the water is filling, it's quieter. So that's the first thing I'm going to tell you. This was probably shut, and that's why it was quiet. You'll see here we have a button. This turns on the water pump. So whoever was in here, was probably me, washed my hands after I had pressed this button down here to flush the toilet. Now I'm going to flush the toilet so Sue can get a little bit of the noise on what it sounds like. It's important to listening to not only how the cycle sounds, but when the cycle ends, because that's where my problem lied. The pump shut off, the cycle ended. That's how it's supposed to normally happen. So you might be asking yourself, Mark, if this started leaking after you went to the bathroom and you had everything shut and you didn't know about it, how long was it running and how did you discover it? And I would say to you, excellent question. Well, we went next door, 100 feet away in our rig. Remember, we weren't hooked up to water, so we weren't worried about that. The thing we missed is we did not turn our water pump off like we do 99% of the time. And then the icing on the cake was that our valve had failed. Well, we went next door and we had a great dinner with our friend Mel. And about literally an hour and a half or 2 hours later, I finally badgered my wife Sue enough to get some of the oatmeal cookies that I had made. Now that's a pretty big deal for me to actually sit down and do some cooking like that. And so I really wanted to share those with Mel, and we had coffee going and everything. So she comes over here. It's like pushing 9 o'clock at night, and she comes walking in here, and she can hear water running and gurgling, and she comes walking in here and sees the water running off the top here and going underneath there. So trust me, that party that night ended real quickly, and we ended up back here mopping up water, opening up bays, putting fans in.
Oh, don't forget, it was raining that day too.
It was?
Yeah, so I was outside pulling stuff out of the bay in the rain.
Yeah, and I had forgotten that. And quite honestly, we're bad YouTubers because it was so traumatic to us. We thought and we knew we should film it, and I just couldn't do it. I mean, it was bad. This valve that was super cheap, I'll put up on screen what it was. This valve flooded part of our basement and a little bit of this area. And I have a video in the back of what the back of our toilet looks like. I was under duress. I'm apologizing. It's not as good as our usual work, but I'll show you what it looks like. And it might have been when I was halfway through taking this one out. I don't fix a lot of stuff on my rig, but I was kind of in a happy mood when we were in St. Augustine's. So this is when I fixed this. But what happened is this bowl ended up to continue to fill with fresh water. Thank you, Jesus, it was fresh water. And it eventually started overflowing the top rim because this valve That's the flush valve that's energized by this button and controlled by the brain that is down in one of my bays. I theorized that it wasn't the brain, but that in fact it was the valve. And it seems that I guessed right, because we haven't had a problem with it since. But the water overflowed, and it overflowed enough, and thank God the tilt of the rig was this way, and it went into my old favorite spot for it to leak, the same spot I had fixed a couple years earlier, and it's just dripping out through the floor. So the takeaway here is to listen to the cycle, memorize what it sounds like to make sure you know what a healthy valve sounds like, and kind of wait until the cycle is done before you move on to do anything else during your life, I guess, from now on. Remember, you have two of these. You have one in the back and you have one here. That valve I showed you was extremely easy to get to for a guy like me. And if you have a newer rig, it's even easier to get to because it'll be outside when you open your fire escape door. That valve is in the back of the toilet and you can get at it from the outside. In my case, I'll have to pull the toilet up because my toilet is against the wall. The other thing is, remember, always turn off your water pump. It's as easy as that. Let's talk about the flood that we are trying to prevent and never have. We're going to be talking about the clothes washer. Now, I'm here to tell you, when you're full-time RV, and especially during COVID, this was worth its weight in gold. And still to this day, we love this setup. We've already had this one fail down in the bottom. It was a Whirlpool, I think, and it was a piece of junk compared to this Splendide, which is awesome. We did a video on this. We had it done at National Indoor because this stuff weighs 1,000,000 pounds and I can't lift this stuff anymore. So if you want to see this and the model numbers, actually I think we replaced them both at the same time because why not? You're in there anyways. So I want to show that the piping in these things exists just like it does in a residential home. So if you look back here, Sue, you could see that the first line of defense, you want to use braided hoses on these fittings to make sure that these hoses don't decide one day to blow out. But what I really wanted to point out was this gray hose here, because this gray hose is the hose that exits the water for your wash machine. Now, I want you to show my hands, honey, up here, because that gray pipe that I was just showing there goes into a black piece of PVC pipe that's about this tall, and it just goes down into the main piping and it goes over to the gray tank. And the unbelievable thing is that they don't want to pressurize this unit sending water to the gray tank. Therefore, this black pipe that I'm telling you that is standing about this high, it's slightly lower than this, that gray hose that I show you, which is smaller diameter, just goes into this pipe and it's just laying there. So you want to make sure that the gray pipe, first of all, from the washer is fastened. But the thing that I'm telling you is that it's open to atmosphere. If you fill the gray tank, and if it starts coming out of here, and pressure would build up enough, or the water would not go away fast enough, the gray hose will eventually start filling this pipe, and that water, gray water, will start coming out. It'll fill this tray, and if this thing is real full, and it was a full capacity, you could have water all over the place here. So when you're running your washing machine, it does require a little planning. We recommend that if you're going to be doing laundry on a day that you're also going to be leaving to go out to dinner or go to an event or something, back calculate from that time that you're leaving, knowing how long it takes for this machine to cycle, and run this machine only when you're in the rig. And then you can transfer it to the dryer, and with clear conscience, you can leave the rig. Remember, when you leave the rig, you're supposed to turn your water off and you're supposed to turn your pump off. You can't have this thing running when you leave, because when you turn that water off, you'll get an error code and it'll screw up that load of laundry and you'll have to start over. Until we get to meet you on the road again or in a campground someday, we invite you to join us on most Sunday mornings for another episode of our journey in Myles.